Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're going to be starting today part 2 of environmental review permitting. But as usual, I'll give it a few minutes for everyone to get in and get settled. I see our audience is growing. And grab a coffee, get comfy. Or an herbal tea. You never know. Thanks for joining us. I'll get started in just a few after the hour. In case you haven't joined us for Land Development Academy yet, I'll go ahead and put the web address in the chat so that you can visit our website and check out what we've been up to and where we're headed. Our next class is going to be Tree Smart at the Permitting and Development Center. I see that there's someone here who missed part 1. And I do want to reassure you that if you were not with us yesterday, we did record that meeting and it will be posted to the website. It might take us a week or two. I don't have a real accurate ETA on that, but we do have someone who edits and kind of clips it and stuff before we put it up. But it'll be up there eventually. And we'll have that slide deck as well. If you're really burning for the slide deck, there is another version of it, which is very similar. And it's from the time that Mike delivered this presentation back in June. So if you don't want to wait for this one, it's pretty much almost the same slide deck. All right, so I'll go ahead and get us started. For anyone who just joined, good morning. My name is Bianca Machuda, and I am the Community Engagement Specialist with Austin Development Services. And again, just want to thank you all for joining us at the Land Development Academy. We're always excited for these presentations, and really a lot of our excitement is because y'all are excited. It's just been such a popular series, and it feels great to have this connection with everyone. We're all coming together to learn about site plan review, and we have experts coming from across all the city departments who work with site plans, and we're covering different areas of the site plan review process. So today's session, again, was held in person back in June, but we received a lot of requests to have a virtual version. So here we are today, and we're going to continue where we left off yesterday. Today's session is part 2 of 2. And if you are here with a group of people, as in there's more than a single person viewing with you, go ahead and enter into the chat box how many people are in your group participating today. And that'll let us know exactly how many folks are with us, because sometimes we know that groups come together to view on a single device or something like that. So we have 2 hours set aside for today's program, but we're thinking we may wrap up sooner than that. We're going to start with the presentation and we'll close with a Q&A session. And we'll also have multiple Q&A breaks throughout the webinar. We'll be learning a lot, so we want to keep you involved, and any questions that you have, please do feel free to either enter them into the Q&A bank, which is at the bottom of your screen. It's a little speech bubble with a question mark in it, and it says Q&A underneath that. And those you can type in at any time during the presentation. It is different than the chat box, just to be clear. So make sure it's the Q&A bank and not the chat. And the other alternative is that you can ask your question live by using the raised hand function, and that will be during the Q&A portion. So throughout, you can type in the Q&A bank, or during the Q&A portions, you can raise your hand and speak. So if you have any issues with either of those functions, feel free to chat myself in the chat and I'll try to troubleshoot with you. I want to let you know that we hope to be able to answer all of your questions, but if we get stumped or we don't have time or something like that, we will be sending out a follow-up response. So all of our questions and answers will be sent out to the attendees after the session. And a note, we are also recording today's session, so you'll get a link to both the presentation and the recording once they're ready. So I think that's all of our admin stuff. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mike McDougall and get us started. Thanks, Mike.
Awesome, thank you. So my name is Mike McDougall, Environmental Policy Program Manager, and there's my phone number and email address on the screen. And as I mentioned yesterday, the email address pattern of the city is usually just first name dot last name at austintexas.gov. So I am, of course, Mike.McDougall at austintexas.gov. Feel free to shoot me an email with any questions you have or give me a call. I'm happy to answer the questions. Bianca had mentioned this as far as the engagement format a minute ago. Bianca, did you want to speak to this or should I go on to the next slide?
Go ahead. I think I covered it.
Okay, I think so. Thanks. So we'll cover 2 hours today, probably a little bit less. We'll take a break and there will be time for questions at the end of the day and several times during the presentation. So we are covering yesterday and today a total of 8 topics. Yesterday we covered 4 and today we'll cover the next 4. And yesterday we covered the watershed classifications and regulations, impervious cover, construction on slopes, and the grading limits and grading administrative variances. And today we'll cover critical water quality zone regulations, water quality transition zone regulations, erosion sedimentation control requirements, and landscape requirements and compatibility requirements. And so actually that brings us to our first question break. And so I just want to give an opportunity to see if anybody wanted to ask a question about what we covered yesterday, clarification. So Bianca, are there any questions at this point?
Yes, I do have one question that was in the chat box, but I'll ask y'all to please do enter your questions into the Q&A box. That helps me to keep track of them when I'm writing up the written summaries for everyone. But I'll go ahead and read this one from the chat. It says, do the site plan application instructions for water quality and drainage plan requiring a payment to city in lieu of water quality pond apply?
So that sounds like the fee in lieu question. That's actually reviewed by the water quality drainage team, and that's a different team than the environmental team, my team. But my understanding is that in some areas of the city, rather than providing a water quality pond, a person can pay into the something called fee in lieu. It's a water quality pond fund. And so basically someone is buying into city water quality ponds. That's the extent of my understanding. Even that's a little bit shaky because it's not what my team does. So I'd have to defer to Kenna Pierce. She's the manager of the water quality drainage team. And water quality does apply, but not all sites are eligible for the fee in lieu payment option. But I would recommend for for a detailed answer and a more certain answer, I think Kenna Pierce would be the best person to talk to. And her email address is Kenna, Kena .Pierce, Pierce, at austintexas.gov.
Great. And Kenna is actually going to be doing 2 sessions in November, early November, probably in mid-November, about both water quality and drainage, 2 separate presentations for each of those. So you will also get a chance to learn more with her that way. There was a follow-up on that question, which is, are all of the requirements for water quality / drainage plan, do they still apply for the urban watershed?
I believe they do. but I couldn't speak to that with any confidence because the pond requirements are done by Kenna's team, whether they're required or not, as well as the design requirements. My team looks at the vegetation plan in the ponds and also the pond depth and pond location. So Kenna's team is the how and the if it's necessary. My team is the where can it be built. So, for example, a person couldn't build a pond too close to the creek or dig it too deep, as we mentioned yesterday, if you're close to the creek. And so my team would look at that. But if the whether or not the pond's required and how the pond is designed is something that Ken's team would look at. So there's a lot of separation of regulations based on specific background and education and experience. So that's a little bit beyond what I do. So I couldn't give a complete answer on that.
You. I see we have some new folks joining us. I just want to give us all a second. We're taking questions. If anyone has anything they would like to ask as it pertains to part one of the webinar, which was held yesterday, feel free to either raise a hand or enter a question into the Q&A box. We'll give it just another minute, and if not, we'll get started on new content for today. All right, I don't see any questions coming in, so we can move on. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. So the immediate topics are the critical water quality zone regulations and water quality transition zone regulations. And those regulations are very similar, so we'll kind of cover them in a pretty rapid sequence, or back to back, not necessarily rapid. So a critical water quality zone and a water quality transition zone are intended to keep space between construction and creeks. And so the idea is to have a buffer area along creeks that's a low build or no build zone to keep the construction away from the creeks. And so if a creek has 64 acres of drainage or more, it's called a classified waterway. And so obviously land drains to the creeks, and a certain square footage or acreage of land will drain to a creek. And so once 64 acres of land drains to a creek, it becomes a classified waterway, which means that it has this no build or low build area adjacent to the creek. That is, once a creek has 64 acres of drainage going to it, it has a critical water quality zone and possibly also a water quality transition zone. And the Land Development Code limits development adjacent to these creeks when they have at least 64 acres of drainage. And so a classified waterway will have a critical water quality zone, or CWQZ. In the drinking water protection zone, there will also be a water quality transition zone. And so to give a little more background on that, creek with 64 acres of drainage in any watershed in the city will have a critical water quality zone. If we're in the western three watersheds, water supply suburban, water supply rural, or Barton Springs zone, if there's a critical water quality zone, then there will also be a water quality transition zone. And so I will have a slide showing what that looks like here coming up. But basically, 64 acres means critical in the urban and suburban. 64 acres on the western three watersheds means there's a critical and a transition zone. As I mentioned before, construction in the critical water quality zone and the water quality transition zone is very limited. And so why do we limit construction adjacent to creeks? Well, the ECM section 1.5.1 says by promoting healthy soils and vegetation along the creek corridor and allowing the stream adequate space to migrate over time, stream buffers help control flood impacts, reduce channel erosion and property loss, help maintain good water quality, reduce operation and maintenance costs, and provide multiple community benefits. To put that in simpler terms, the vegetation found along the creeks can intercept pollution and stormwater runoff, and it can slow how quickly the pollution gets to the creeks. It can also capture or break down the pollution to some extent. So having this vegetation preserved along the creeks provides free water quality for the city, so for all of us. So we keep by preserving the vegetation along the creeks, we help keep the water quality improved. So, for example, in older parts of the city, like off of Hancock, the Yarborough Branch Library, the parking lot drains directly to the creek. So if you imagine any oil that leaks out of a car goes right to the creek, not very good. That was done 50 years ago or so. More modern requirements say, no, can't drain a parking lot directly to the creek. we want some space so that pollution doesn't get right into the creek right away and immediately affect the water quality. Second, by preserving the vegetation, it also allows room for the animals. A lot of animals will live in or around the water. They'll live in the water, crawl out of the water to reproduce, go back into the water, and they need this vegetation along the creek as part of their habitat. So we want to preserve the vegetation for their water quality, but also to keep the local ecosystem intact, give the critters space to live, reproduce, and eat. So as I mentioned waterway setbacks a second ago. The critical water quality zones and water quality transition zones are collectively called waterway setbacks. So if your environmental reviewer says there's a waterway setback along this creek, that's just a simpler way of saying there's a critical water quality zone and possibly a water quality transition zone along the creek. Just means an area of limited construction adjacent to the creek. Urban and suburban watershed classifications have a critical water quality zone, just the critical, when there's 64 acres of drainage. The water supply suburban, water supply rural, and Barton Springs zone have both the water quality transition zone and a critical water quality zone. And so, again, 64 acres of drainage means there's a critical. This is what a critical water quality zone would look like in the city of Austin property profile. So obviously the blue going down the middle is the creek center line, and the hashed area is just the critical water quality zone. And so if this is on the property based on city of Austin property profile, then there's a pretty good chance that that critical water quality zone does exist on the property. I've only seen a handful of cases where the critical water quality zone was challenged by someone who said, no, there's not 64 acres of drainage. I want to rerun the numbers. And the city says, oh, yep, there's not a critical. Most of the time, 99% of the time, if the critical water quality zone shows up on the property on property profile, then there is a critical on the property. But if the developer believes that that's inaccurate, they can certainly challenge that and provide evidence saying there's not a critical water quality zone. But this is an image from property profile. This is what a critical water quality zone would look like. This is an image from the drinking water protection zone. And so you can see the creek center line down the middle. The inner hash mark is the critical water quality zone. The outer hash mark is the water quality transition zone. So the critical water quality zone is just a band on each side of the creek. And then if there's a transition zone, there's another band outside the critical. So just a series of parallel bands limiting construction adjacent to the creek. So what is allowed in the critical water quality zone? I mentioned there's a lot of development restrictions. Well, that's in LDC 258261. And in 258261 starts off by saying development is prohibited in a critical water quality zone. And then it says except, and it goes into substantial detail describing what is allowed. This is also clarified in ECM 1.5.3. So fundamentally, the Land Development Code says no development in the critical water quality zone except, and then it says, so thou shalt not, and then it has a lot of exclusions where, okay, you can do this in the critical. A lot of those exceptions then have additional requirements. So what was an example of one of those exceptions? So what might be allowed in the critical? Well, the code says you can't build in the critical, and then when it says except, one of the exceptions is that utilities may cross directly into or through the critical water quality zone. Obviously, water utility power has to cross creeks. Another exception of what is allowed in the critical is a public street. Open space is allowed, and parkland is allowed in the critical water quality zone. So there's a long list of exceptions, and if there's a critical water quality zone on a property that's going to be developed, I would say call your environmental reviewer sooner rather than later, just to get an idea of what might be allowed, what options might exist. Certainly, it's always easy to adjust the design early in the process. But essentially, nothing's allowed in the critical except what's listed as the exclusions or exceptions. So 258261 is complicated and lengthy. What is allowed in the critical water quality zone varies substantially by watershed classification, and there are construction and design requirements. So, yep, as I mentioned a second ago, I recommend speaking to an environmental reviewer as needed just to get a handle on it. Yesterday, I mentioned that there are administrative variances in the code, and they're all in 25842. There are some administrative variances that apply to the critical water quality zone. Not many, but a few. So one of them is that 25842 includes an administrative variance to allow a private driveway or a public street to cross a critical water quality zone if we're not in the Barton Springs zone. There are some design requirements associated with that and some conditions associated with that. But basically, if somebody cannot access the right of way from their property without crossing the critical, it might be possible to get an administrative variance. And that can be tremendous because it's much quicker and much less expensive than a land use commission variance. LDC 258262 describes when a public road or private driveway may cross the critical. So 258262 gives allowances for these crossings. If that doesn't fit, perhaps 25842 will give us an administrative variance option. So there's a number or a handful of places in code where we might build across the critical with a driveway or a street. And again, design requirements and site conditions are lengthy. So I would recommend if you're looking at a street crossing of the critical or a driveway crossing of the critical, please call your environmental reviewer to discuss that and figure out how to get a handle on that. And with that, that brings us to another Q&A break. So Bianca, do we have any questions?
I don't see anything right now. If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. All right, I don't see any questions coming up. We're good to keep going.
Okay, I'll go into the next item. So the next item is the water quality transition zone. So as I mentioned, the water quality transition zones only exist in the drinking water protection zone, the western three watersheds, water supply suburban, water supply rural, and Barton Spring zone. If you have a critical water quality zone and you're in the western three watersheds, there will be a water quality transition zone. Now, I mentioned a second ago that the critical water quality zone restrictions are all in 258261. The water quality transition zone code requirements are in different sections based on the watershed classification. So I won't read all this, but if you want to get a screen grab, this is a useful information to have. But this basically tells us where in the code, based on the watershed classification, the water quality transition zone code regulations exist. And then, of course, ECM 154 is a good reference for the transition zone requirements. So what is allowed in the water quality transition zone? Well, it varies based on the watershed classification and the recharge zone status. So if we're water supply suburban and over the South Edwards Aquifer recharge zone, whatever's allowed in the critical is also allowed in the transition zone. And also, beyond that, minor drainage facilities or water quality controls that comply with LDC 258263 floodplain modification and the floodplain modification criteria in the ECM are allowed. So what does all this mean? Well, water supply suburban plus South Edwards recharge zone, the transition zone equals the critical. Whatever's allowed in the critical is allowed in the transition zone, and also some minor drainage or water quality control facilities. And what that means or how that's defined is in the code and criteria as well. So the transition zone is typically equal to the critical plus a little bit more. So if we're not over the South Edwards Aquifer recharge zone and water supply suburban, then it just has a lower impervious cover limit of 18%. So if we're adjacent to a creek in water supply suburban in the transition zone and not the South Edwards Aquifer recharge zone, the impervious cover limit is just 18%. This does not include the area in the 100-year floodplain. So it gets a little bit more confusing because it's water supply or water supply suburban, not South Edwards Aquifer recharge zone, transition zone, but not floodplain. So there's a lot of layers, a lot of filters in that consideration. But if once we clear all those, it's just an impervious cover limit of 18%. And the code does say the impervious cover limit does not apply to a public mobility project in the right of way allowed to cross a critical, and water quality controls may be in a transition zone that does not lie over the South Edwards Aquifer recharge zone. So very, very complicated and detail oriented for sure. And if there's a transition on the property, I would recommend calling the environmental reviewer as well, just to get a handle on what all this means. So to summarize, if we're water supply suburban over the South recharge zone, the transition zone equals the critical, and also minor drainage facilities or water quality controls are allowed with some limitations. If we're water supply suburban transition zone, but not over the recharge zone, it's just an 18% impervious cover limit. A second of the three western watersheds is water supply rural. And so if we are a transition zone, water supply rural, over the South Edwards Aquifer recharge zone, development in the transition zone, or what's allowed in the critical is allowed in the transition zone, plus also minor drainage facilities or water quality controls. So this is very similar to what we saw a second ago for water supply suburban. So water supply rural, transition zone, South Edwards Aquifer recharge zone, transition zone equals the critical, but also we can have minor drainage facilities or water quality controls. What if we're not over the transition zone? Excuse me, what if we're not over the recharge zone? It gets very confusing because we're dealing with watershed classification, how far we are from a creek, and whether or not we're over an aquifer recharge zone. So if we're not over the recharge zone, you can do in the transition zone what's allowed in the critical. Streets or public mobility projects are allowed. Yet again, minor drainage facilities or water quality controls are allowed. And then we can have duplex or single family residential development. And yesterday I mentioned that kind of peculiar ratio. It pops up again. So for a transition zone in this situation, duplex or single family residential development with a minimum lot size of 2 acres and a density of not more than 1 unit for each 3 acres, excluding acreage in the 100-year floodplain. So what this tells us is that we can also have single family and duplex in the transition zone of water supply rural if we're not over the recharge zone. It can get very, very detail oriented, kind of a rabbit hole. So yet again, if there's a transition zone, I recommend calling the environmental reviewer to discuss the regulations. The third of the 3 Western 3 watersheds is the Barton Springs zone. And this one, I put south and struck through south intentionally because a second ago, it was always if we're over the south recharge zone or not. This is just simply over the recharge zone. So for Barton Springs zone, transition zone, and over just the recharge zone, whether it's north or south, then this applies. So development of the critical is allowed. Excuse me. Development that's allowed in the critical is allowed in the transition zone. So the transition zone equals the critical. We've seen that before. And we've seen this before, minor drainage facilities or water quality controls. So if we're recharge zone, transition zone, Barton Springs, the transition zone equals the critical, except that we can also have minor drainage facilities or water quality controls that comply with these requirements of code and criteria. The Barton Springs requirements a little less detail oriented, but it's a kind of a pattern here. The same language pops up over and over. And what happens if we're Barton Springs zone, transition zone, and not over the recharge zone? Well, the transition zone equals the critical. We also can have minor drainage facilities or water quality controls, and we can have streets, and we can have duplex or single family residential with a minimum lot size of 2 acres and a density of not more than 1 unit for each 3 acres. So we've seen all that before as well. So Barton Springs zone transition, not recharge. If you can do it in the critical, you can do it in the transition zone, plus minor drainage or water quality controls, streets, and some duplex or single family residential. So it gets very, very detail oriented very quickly. So again, if there's a transition zone or a critical, I would say call the EV reviewer and just talk it over with them and see what the requirements are and what options might exist. Now, speaking of options, in the critical water quality zone, only in the suburban watershed, there's something called buffer averaging, just the suburban watershed and just for the critical. And so the basic concept is the critical, rather than move the development outside the critical, we can move the critical away from the development. So the critical water quality zone can be squeezed up to half its standard width. The critical must be expanded to equal or greater amount elsewhere. And the expansion must be contiguous to the critical water quality zone. The expansion should maintain a reasonable connection with the functions of the riparian zone and floodplain. The expansion area should not be over CEFs. What does all this mean? It's like squeezing a balloon. In the suburban watershed, you can squeeze the critical up to half its width. It's just going to pop out somewhere else, just like squeezing a balloon. And that's a very simple way to describe it, but I think it's an effective way. You can move the critical water quality zone in the suburban watershed, just like squeezing a balloon. You squeeze it up to half its width, it'll just pop out somewhere else. These requirements are in ECM 152D and LDC 25892B4. But the takeaway is there's some flexibility. Instead of designing around the critical in the suburban watershed, maybe we can design the critical around the development. So we just move things around a little bit. And that I've certainly seen that used as a helpful way to get out of variances and still comply with code and protect the water quality of the creek as needed. And with that, I will ask if there are any questions, Bianca.
Yes, we've got a couple of questions here in the Q&A box. So, first question, when a larger development adjusts the point where the critical water quality zone starts, it says at 64 AC, I guess that's acres. Does the existing critical water quality zone still apply, or does only the proposed critical water quality zone apply? Does the same apply for the impacted water quality transition zone?
So as if I understand the question correctly, it's somebody builds something directly upstream at the beginning of the critical, and in doing that, they change the amount of water draining to the creek. And so if they do that so that there's no longer 64 acres draining to the creek, is there still a critical? And actually, I'm not certain. I think it would that typically that's something that the Watershed Protection Department would look at. I believe that if the development changes the flow and it's built legally into the uplands, I believe that the Watershed Protection Department would say, okay, we see there's not 64 acres of drainage anymore based on this legally built project. So the critical water quality zone would be adjusted downstream. I believe that's how that's done. It doesn't happen very often, so I can't speak to it absolutely. I have seen people run drainage analysis and say there's not 64 acres of drainage based on what's out there right now. City of Austin, your analysis is incorrect. There isn't 64 acres. We believe, therefore, there shouldn't be a critical. And there's a path for doing that. John Clement in Watershed is the person that would look at that information and decide if he agrees with the analysis or not. If he does agree, he will adjust the critical. And so, because basically it's John's decision, and then John tells my team, yes, there's a critical, or no, there's not a critical, and we take that information. And so, because that decision is made outside of my review, I don't know specifically how John would respond to that situation. It's probably case by case. I would say that if someone believes there's not 64 acres of drainage, that they should certainly reach out to John Clement. And there's actually a website the city has that it's just a web form to fill out to say, we don't believe there's a critical here. We believe your numbers are wrong, City of Austin. We want to challenge that critical. And so I can't give an absolute answer on how how the city might respond to that because it is case by case. But there is a process for and challenging the critical water quality zone.
Okay, so it sounds like they would have to get that form filled out. I'll try
Yes.
to see if I can find that and include that in our Q&A summary. And then there was the second part of the question about whether it also applies for the impacted water quality transition zone. I don't know if you have anything to
Oh,
add for
right, the
that.
impact. So the transition zone exists with the critical. So if John's determination, thanks, Bianca. If John's determination said the critical moves, then the transition zone would also have to move. The transition zone can't exist outside the critical. If there's a critical, there will be a transition. If there's no critical, there won't be a transition zone. They rise and fall together, basically.
Sense. Thank you. Well, complicated things and complicated questions. We've got
Yeah.
so many smart people in the room. Thank you so much, Mike. Let's see. A few more questions here.
Okay.
This next one is from Jay. What is
Okay.
considered a minor drainage facility?
Now that's a good question. That is listed in 258263 and in the ECM. That doesn't come up often, so I don't have the answer to that question immediately available. I would have to just read the code and then come back. I believe though that it speaks to the construction of the pond and the amount of grading necessary for the pond, both the cut to dig down in the pond and the amount of fill to build up any berms around the pond. So I think minor drainage facility is defined based on the amount of grading and the construction techniques necessary to build a pond. And I believe the minor drainage facility also is limited in how much masonry is allowed to be used to build a pond. It's got to be a more of a natural earthen berm pond. But that's something that's only come up a handful of times in my time at the city. And when it does come up, I've got to read the code and criteria. So good question, Jay. You stumped me on that one. I know where to find that, but I don't know that information off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's totally fine. We don't expect you to actually be the book, but if you can point us to the book, that's good.
I, I can
Uh,
I can I can show where that is though.
okay.
Minor drainage facilities have to comply with 258263. And then let's see. I believe I had a code reference, a criteria reference as well. No, it's just well, it's going to be it's ECM section 1, but where in section 1? I would have to look. But 258263 in either ECM section 1.4 or 1.5 would be the definition of what constitutes minor drainage facilities or water quality controls.
Sounds good. No problemo. I will try to look that up and link that in the Q&A summary as well. Um, and we'll move on to the next question.
Okay.
So next question is, can you explain more about the process for establishing or documenting the squeeze of the critical water quality zone? Does the
Yeah,
applicant need to survey the new proposed critical water quality zone and submit it for approval?
Yes, I'd be happy to. That's a great question. A survey is not necessary, and as far as approval, it would be something that would be presented on the site plan on the plan set. And so, what the environmental reviewer will ask for is a delineation of the existing critical, a delineation of the proposed critical, and a delineation of the half critical water quality zone. And the reason is the squeeze can only go to half. So you couldn't squeeze more than 50%. So we'd want to see the half critical to be sure the squeeze doesn't go beyond that half maximum. We'd want to see the proposed critical so we can confirm that there is no development in the proposed critical that isn't allowed. Yeah, for example, a parking lot would not be allowed in the critical water quality zone. So if somebody were adjusting the critical with that buffer averaging, we'd want to see that the buffer is averaged such that it avoids the parking lot and doesn't include the parking lot, because where the buffer average is proposed, that is now the critical water quality zone. We would also want to see the topography to confirm that the proposed critical maintains a reasonable connection with the riparian function of the critical water quality zone. That is, we wouldn't want an expansion that doesn't drain to the creek. The critical water quality zone is intended to be an area that drains to the creek generally, and so the expansion should also drain to the creek. We wouldn't want an expansion that happens to flow the other direction. Um, and then as far as surveys, we wouldn't need a survey. We would just need the topography. The environmental reviewer does typically ask for a brief table saying, please tell me the square footage of the reduction and please tell me the square footage of the expansion, because there shouldn't be a net loss of critical water quality zone. So the expansion should equal or exceed the reduction. They shouldn't reduce, say, by 1,000 square feet, but only expand by 100 square feet. So we'd want the expansion to at least equal the reduction. And then lastly, this gets a little fine-tuned, but the expansion should not include an area that's critical environmental feature buffer, because that's already a protected area. So if we expand the buffer of the critical water quality zone over a critical environmental feature, that actually represents a net reduction in the protected area. So there's some wiggle room there probably, but ideally we wouldn't want to buffer average a critical to expand over an area that's already protected anyway. I think that answers all the questions. Bianca, did I miss anything?
As far as I can tell, that was good.
Okay, excellent.
All
Any
right,
more?
one more question.
Okay.
Yes. Can you review the squeezing balloon example again? Okay, never mind. I feel like we kind of did.
Okay.
Perhaps give an example. Are you squeezing the balloon upstream and then the expansion is downstream? I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure. Yes, the expansion, the yes, we could squeeze the balloon in one spot and let it expand somewhere else. That is, we could squeeze the critical here and then, some number of feet, 100 feet downstream, for example, expand the critical. Sometimes people will expand the critical on the other side of the creek. That's okay as well. It gets a little more difficult when somebody wants to reduce the critical on one lot and expand it on another. And the reason that gets difficult is because tracking that can be challenging, especially if the expansion is on an area that's not part of the site plan permit application. So there's a tracking difficulty, but we definitely want to work with the applicant to see how can we make this work. But yes, it's okay to expand the critical to reduce the critical here and expand it there. It's also generally, and there certainly, I'm sure there's going to be exceptions, but these are general answers. So because we'd be looking at the plan set, on a case by case basis. But I've seen people even reduce the critical in one spot and then expand it upstream. So if the critical doesn't begin until there's 64 acres of drainage, well, somebody might squeeze the critical at one point, but then increase where the critical starts, and now maybe the critical starts at 62 acres of drainage. So generally, it's okay to make the expansion go upstream or make the expansion go wider to compensate where we made the critical get thinner. So there's a lot of flexibility with that. I've seen people expand the critical where the land isn't necessarily very buildable anyway. But hey, that's great. If the applicant is finds a way to expand the critical and to suit their needs, and then we're going to build there anyway. Well, it's almost a win-win. We can get through the process a little more easily and still demonstrate compliance with the code. Were there any other questions?
That's all I have so far. Is there anyone else here who's been inspired? Any questions coming up? Feel free to raise your hand if you do. Okay, I've got something, a long one in the chat, and I want to remind y'all, please, to use the Q&A function when you can. It's a little different than the chat. It's also a speech bubble, but it has a question and mark, and it says Q&A in it. I'll go ahead and read this. Let's see. You mentioned necessary, excuse me, you mentioned necessary utility construction is permitted in the critical water quality zone. LDC 25A261 confirms utility construction is sometimes allowed in the critical water quality zone, but 261E1 says, quote, a utility line may be located parallel to or within the critical water quality zone if in a watershed other than urban and located not less than 50 feet from the center line of a minor waterway, 100 feet from the center line of an intermediate waterway, and 150 feet from the center line of a major waterway. Are these distances not the defining boundaries of the critical? Are you able to elaborate on what utility construction limitations are when working in this zone?
Yes, that's a very good question. So the Land Development Code, Section 258261, has a different. If you read the code and really spend some time thinking about this, the code recognizes different types of crossings. So that's a great question, very detail oriented. The code says that a utility may cross directly into or through, and I believe it says to minimize disturbance. And so what that's taken to mean is the utility can cross into the critical or cross through the critical, generally 90 at an angle of 90 degrees. We want to cross generally perpendicular to the critical, and that's okay in most watersheds. A little bit more criteria for the Barton Springs zone, but in general, in most watersheds, a utility can cross into or through the critical if it's a perpendicular crossing. It doesn't have to be exactly perpendicular, and it doesn't say perpendicular in the code. It says in a manner to minimize, I think, the disturbance. So, maybe we have to go 80 degrees because we have to miss a large tree we want to save, or 75 degrees rather than 90, rather than perpendicular, because we want to miss some wetlands or something like that. So built into that code is some requirement that it doesn't just say 90. It's a way that's overall environmentally better. Because if we just said 90, well, maybe we have to take out a 40-inch live oak to do it, and that would be boxing us in too much. So that's one crossing, directly into or through to minimize disturbance. Another crossing is the indirect crossing. Maybe it's going to cross at 30 degrees. Still crossing the critical, but it's 30 degrees. That's not a direct crossing. And so I believe in that situation, that's allowed in most watersheds. I have to look at the code because 25A261 is detail oriented. But I believe the code says in most watersheds, you can do an indirect crossing if you bore the utility and the bore and the receiving pits are outside the critical water quality zone. So that's the indirect crossing. The third type of crossing is one that's really not a crossing at all. It's within and parallel. And that's what I think that quote was from the code. So we have the direct, the indirect, and the parallel and within. So now maybe somebody just needs to put a water line, and it's just going right along, next to the creek, just trucking along the banks parallel to the creek. That's parallel and within. And that's a different animal entirely. Most watershed classifications, that is not allowed. I believe in the urban and suburban, it is allowed. And it is saying that it's not less than 50 feet, not less than 100, not less than 200, blah, blah, blah. In the suburban watershed classification, the critical water quality zone on each side of the creek will be 100, 200, or 300 feet wide. And that section of code speaks of the suburban. It says not less than 50 for a minor, not less than 100 for an intermediate. Basically, what that's saying is that you can be in the suburban watershed, your utility can be parallel and within the critical if we're in the outer half of the critical. So the code has patterns where it follows itself many times. So the bar for averaging, you can squeeze to half the critical in the suburban watershed. While also in the suburban watershed, you can put a utility parallel and within to the critical if you're in the outer half of the critical. So if you look at the definitions of the suburban critical water quality zone in 25.892, it establishes them at 100, 200, and 300 feet wide. And if you look at the parallel and within requirements, and it doesn't say half critical, it'll say 50, 100, 150. When you work those measurements out, it is the half critical. So you can be parallel and within if you're in the outer half of the suburban watershed. And I believe the urban watershed as well, but it's got some different criteria for that. And then it's got other requirements if we're along, I think, Lady Bird Lake. Um, there's also a double riparian revegetation requirement. So if somebody does choose to put or has to put a utility parallel and within the critical in the outer half, the disturbed area has to be revegetated, but then also another area equal to that area of disturbance elsewhere has to be revegetated and brought up to a good riparian healthy standard. So there's a lot there, but fundamentally it's three types of crossing: direct, indirect, and parallel and within. And I could go on for hours about that, and I'm sure nobody wants that. So, Bianca, was more information, or is that adequate?
Oh, I think that was a great answer. Even
Okay.
I understood that.
Awesome.
Thank you. I think that was great. Wonderful question and wonderful answer. Any other questions here? We're almost, I don't have any other written ones, but if anyone wants to raise their hand, now's the time. All right. I think we're good to continue on.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll go to the next item. So this one's a little bit simpler, happily, which we've covered a lot of complicated material in a lot of detail. Erosion sedimentation control requirements. And that's just the black, the 18-inch tall black fence, fabric fence that people see around construction sites. And so when land is developed, well, actually, I'll read the slide a little more clearly. Erosion and sedimentation are naturally occurring processes, but land development accelerates the process of erosion and sedimentation. So when somebody builds a project, often the first thing that happens is that vegetation is removed from the site. When that happens and it rains, the soil washes away and it ends up in creeks, and it does this to the creeks. And obviously, this is really bad for the health of the creek. The critters can't live in this water. The vegetation is destroyed. So when construction occurs, it's easy for soil to wash off the site. And when it washes off the site, it does this to our creeks. It's not good for us to drink this water. It's expensive to treat this water to make it drinkable. And so we require that the city of Austin requires that silt fence, erosion sedimentation control, that black fabric fence around construction sites. So as I mentioned, sediment transport to waterways can affect water quality. Too much erosion and sedimentation negatively impact the city's drinking water supply and the ecosystem. So erosion and sedimentation control is required for land development to promote water quality. And actually, providing erosion control is a city, state, and federal requirement. The city requirements exceed the state and federal requirements. And so there are various ways to prevent erosion from occurring. And one of them, obviously, we can put that black silt fence to hold the soil back. Another way to prevent a lot of erosion from occurring is to minimize the area of the site that is disturbed at any one time during construction. That is, minimize how much area of vegetation is removed. If the vegetation is left in place, the soil will stay in place. Preserving the existing natural vegetation to the greatest extent feasible. Other methods is that covering exposed soils with temporary stabilization soon after disturbance. So that could be, that could be a tarp. That if it's a small area, that can be wood chips. That can be, I think, let's see, filter fabric. All sorts of things. We can restore the vegetation as rapidly as possible in the disturbed areas. So when the soil is exposed, get the vegetation growing back there as soon as possible to help keep the soil in place. Keep the velocity of stormwater below the erosive level. So obviously, the steeper the site, the faster the water will run off the site. The faster it runs, the more erosion will occur. So we want to develop the flatter sites, not the more steep sites. Promoting sheet flow rather than concentrated flow. Obviously, if there's a sheet flow of water across the site, that's going to have less impact than if we just have a gully being washed out on a site, taking a lot of sediment with it. Protecting and maintaining stable slopes, and limiting grading and limiting construction on slopes. So when I mentioned yesterday where the city limits the amount of fill that's allowed on a site, the city limits the slopes over 15%, the construction allowed on those slopes. The reason is in part to keep the soil in place. The more fill there is, the more soil can wash off during construction. The steeper the slope, the more likely the soil will wash off during construction. So Let's see, I mentioned covering exposed soils with temporary stabilization soon after disturbance, restoring vegetation as rapidly as possible in disturbed areas. These ideas are just basically after, as soon as we can, we want to get that vegetation put back to keep the soil in place, to keep uh, good erosion control method. Here's an image of that the silt fence. I don't believe this is the City of Boston standard silt fence, but it's a great stock photo. So putting silt fence up to catch the soil so it doesn't run off the site is a great way to prevent erosion sedimentation from occurring. So we want to keep the sediment within the limit of construction. This is done with silt fence or triangular filter dike or mulch sock. Another way to keep the soil on or within the limit of construction is with temporary sediment basins and dewatering skimmers. So the ECM Appendix P1 or P4 sequence of construction says that rough grading the ponds has to be done early in the process. So if the ponds are rough graded to full capacity, those ponds can actually act as sediment basins. So in a perfect scenario, and a lot of things have to occur for this to work out properly, and that's something the environmental reviewer would look for. Um, if the sediment basins are rough graded at the start of construction, any soil that's washed away will find its way to those basins instead of washing off site. So we could look at sediment at the ponds acting as temporary sediment basins to capture the soil, and we want dewatering skimmers to skim the water off the top of these basins so they don't fill up. And so the idea is the water is skimmed off the top, and the sediment drops to the bottom of the pond. So as I mentioned, silt fence is one of the erosion sedimentation control techniques. So silt fence acts as a barrier or a dam to keep surface water and sediment on site. So in this image, you can see that the water is kind of being ponded by this silt fence. If we're keeping the water on site, then we're keeping the sediment suspended in that water on site as well, which is a good thing. And so the city looks at silt fence as basically a dam. And so a larger limit of construction would require more silt fence. So, the bigger your construction, the bigger the dam has to be. Less intuitive is that a steeper slope reduces how much a silt fence can dam, but I have an image for that. So if we consider this as this dam as silt fence, well, we can hold this whole volume of water behind the dam on a flat site. But if the site isn't very flat, that silt fence can't dam up as much water. So a larger limit of construction will require more silt fence, and a steeper limit of construction will require more silt fence because the silt fence is effectively a dam. And as the site becomes more, as the site is steeper, less silt fence can hold. Silt fence holds less water behind it. Now, that is all described a little bit better in ECM Table 145G1. That table provides information describing how much silt fence is required based on the limit of construction area and the slope within the limit of construction. So when your EV reviewer is asking for more silt fence, it's likely based on this table. Your reviewer has probably run the numbers of the average slope on the site, the LOC area, compared that to the table and said, okay, you have to have 500 linear feet of silt fence downslope of the site to contain all the water we expect to be running off this site. The same concepts generally apply to TFD and mulch sock as well. But essentially, when your EV reviewer is saying, hey, we need more silt fence, it's based on this idea. Now, EV review will typically ask for ESC along the upslope LOC boundary. And I had an engineer reach out to me and say, why do you want upslope silt fence? Water doesn't flow uphill. That's a great point. However, the downslope silt fence has to account for the water raining onto the site, that is rainfall, and any water that drains into the site from upslope. So the basic idea is we can either let the water run onto the site from upslope and then keep it on the site, or put upslope silt fence to act as a barrier to divert the water around the LOC to begin with so it never picks up the sediment. And so the silt fence has to account for rain falling onto the LOC and also for water running onto the site from upslope. And it's easier to divert potential surface water runoff around the site than it is to prevent runoff from the LOC. So just don't let the water get there to begin with is the basic idea. Now, it's not done every time, though, because upslope silt fence could possibly create drainage issues for that upslope property. And so the EV reviewer and the design engineer should collaborate on this. I've had engineers say, I can't put upslope silt fence. That's going to flood this other property. Okay, understood. But now we have to put silt fence on the downslope LOC that accounts for the rainfall and the run on from the upslope property. So the consideration gets a little more complicated. But between the engineer and the AV reviewer, we always find a way to make it work. And best to do it during the review, and then have the EV inspector come along during the inspection and have to adjust the silt fence with the contractor. I can imagine the contractor's never too pleased when they've got to add more silt fence after the fact. So best to get it done during the review. I mentioned temporary sediment basins a second ago. So if a water quality detention pond is proposed as part of the construction, this pond can possibly be used as a temporary sediment basin during construction. The water is going to run to it anyway. Well, it's going to take the sediment to it. So we can use that temporary sediment basin and capture sediment there. And the presence of a temporary sediment basin means that the quantity of required silt fence and mulch stock in TFD is reduced. So by letting the water stay on the side of those ponds, we don't have to capture as much on the downslope limited construction. So that can be a very helpful technique as well. Okay, with that, that was erosion sedimentation control in a nutshell. Bianca, are there any questions?
I have one that just came through.
Okay.
How would you approach and mitigate a request from construction to cause temporary disturbance within the critical due to a lack of space in non-critical areas?
That's a good question. Typically, the typical interpretation of the code is that the LOC cannot enter into the critical water quality zone unless the LOC is for something that's allowed in the critical. So, for example, a utility can cross the critical. Well, if a utility can cross the critical, the LOC to build that utility must enter into the critical. So the LOC for the utility going into the critical would be allowed. On the other hand, a parking lot is not allowed in the critical. And so generally we would say, well, if the parking lot's not allowed in the critical, the LOC for the parking lot should not enter into the critical either. The idea is to minimize disturbance in the critical water quality zone. And so if something's allowed in the critical, the LOC to build that thing allowed in the critical is I think self-evident. But if something's not allowed in the critical, well, then the critical shouldn't be disturbed anyway. So we typically do not allow, say, for a parking lot that's not allowed the critical, the LOC for that parking lot should not encroach into the critical either. Now there might be exceptions. Maybe the critical's in just really bad shape. Maybe somebody mowed that critical. Scalped it down to the ground, and encroaching into the critical is not going to really do anything. But then when the construction's done, well, that LOC area has to be revegetated. And so maybe the critical will be better for it after all. So there might be a little bit of wiggle room on a case by case basis, but ideally the best thing to do is just to not get in the critical. But if it's in really bad shape, well, maybe it'll be better when we're done than when we got there. So maybe there's an opportunity for improvement. But in general, we can only get the LOC in the critical if it's in support of something that's allowed to be built in the critical.
So the original question was due to lack of space in
Yes.
non-critical.
Mhm.
So if it were something non-critical and they didn't have space and they're getting pushed into a critical area, I guess it just depends on what the actual construction is that's in that non-critical area.
I think it would. I don't believe the code of criteria would really give any allowance to consider what the space is. I think if the site is so tight that it just can't be done, I think we try to find a way, trying to find a path forward. If on the other hand, it's a matter of, well, the buildings would have to scoot over a few feet to make the space, that might be the path we'd have to look at. So it really depends on the situation. But if it's just a situation where someone would want to maximize the building size, or we might say, well, I'm sorry, we've got a buffer average, we'd have to look at a land use commission variance, or we'd have to move the building, or maybe make the building a little bit smaller. So I think that would be really a case by case situation. But in general, the intent is to leave the critical water quality zone undisturbed. And so that's really the guiding principle. And then it's okay, with that as a guiding principle, what can we do to make this work? How can we find a path forward that's code compliant and adheres to the idea of leaving the critical water quality zone undisturbed?
Good. Good answer. All these are so specific. It's hard
They
to
are.
give. Yeah, I mean, I think you're doing a great job of giving us
Thanks.
like the general idea without, like you said, these are all general answers.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Do
Everything is
not
so
quote
case by
this
case. Yeah, yes, exactly.
for
Thank you. Yeah,
informational purposes only.
yeah, it's very much case by case. And we'll take variances. If we have to take a variance, we'll take a variance. But environmental review, We'd much rather just find, is there a path to compliance with, design changes, administrative variance? Is there a way to move this forward without a land use commission variance? We'll do it if we have to, but so much better if we can avoid that. So yeah, it definitely is case by case though.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anyone else would like to raise their hand or submit a question? Do we have any here in the box? All right, I think we're good to continue.
Okay,
Thank
excellent.
you.
Thank you. So the very last item 8 of 8, is the landscape requirements and compatibility requirements. So I'll first start off with the locations where landscape requirements do not apply. And this is in ECM section 2. So the most notable exceptions to the landscape requirements are property zoned downtown mixed use DMU or central business district CBD, a lot containing one single family residence, a lot containing one duplex residence, unless the residence exceeds 4,000 exceeding 4,000 square feet of gross floor area or has more than 6 bedrooms, or in the ETJ, except City of Austin funded projects. So these are all the situations where landscape requirements are not applicable. If your ETJ bids a City of Austin project, then the city is still going to require landscape of itself. So what are the landscape requirements? In summary, there's 6 requirements. And I'll have images for all of these, but first I'll just go over all of them. So at least 20% of the area between the building and the right-of-way must be landscaped or grass. And so imagine HEB. The area between the front wall of HEB and the right-of-way is called the street yard. And 20% of that street yard must have landscaping or grass. Trees are also required between the building and the right-of-way. So based on how big that street yard is, the area between the building and the right-of-way, a certain number of trees are required. Parking lots must be screened from the right-of-way with a wall or decorative fence or vegetation. So we have to screen the parking lot from the view of the right-of-way. Parking lot islands and trees are required within 50 feet of each parking space. So there has to be islands and trees within 50 feet of each parking space in the parking lot. Parking lot islands must be at least 8 feet wide. And then on the last one, there's a minimum square footage of parking lot islands and medians and peninsulas based on the quantity of parking spaces. And so it's just a ratio. If you have so many parking spaces, you must have so many square footage of medians. And so item 4 says you have to have an island within 50 feet of each parking space. Item 6 tells us how many square feet of islands we have to have. So one is a density or distribution, and one is a size requirement. But I have images for all of these because I know just reading that is confusing. So here's the street yard, the first item. At least 20% of the area between the building and the right-of-way must be grass or landscape. So there's the frontage of 290, and there's a building. So that red box is the street yard area. That's the area between the building and the right-of-way. So 20% of that area has to be vegetated. It has to be landscaped or grass or something. Just 20. So your environmental reviewer would say, what's that total area in square feet? Is at least 20% of that area vegetated. Here's another example. I'll jump back for a second. This is with the parking lot in the front. 20% applies. With the parking lot behind the building, the same 20% required is applicable. Now in this one, it's almost 100% of the area is landscape. But so this one, you just eyeball it and say, yes, I see that 20% of the area between the building and the right-of-way is indeed landscape. But these are just 2 different examples showing the 20% vegetation requirement. But what if there is no building and the entire area is a parking lot? So what if it's a paid parking lot? Well, ECM 241B says, then the whole thing is street yard. So if there's no building, then the whole lot is considered street yard. So rather than the street yard being defined as the area between the building and the right-of-way, if there's no building, the whole lot is a street yard, and 20% of the whole lot would have to be vegetated. Another requirement is that trees are required in the street yard. And so there has to be a certain number, a certain quantity of trees between the building and the right-of-way. Existing trees can count. And here's that ratio. So the quantity of trees required is based on the size of the street yard. And it's just a decreasing rate structure. So if your street yard area is 1,000 to 10,000 square feet, you have to have 1 tree for every 1,000 square feet. But if you're between 10,000 and 110,000, well, this is the table. But basically, the larger the street yard, the lower the ratio of trees is required per square foot. But essentially, Based on the size of the street yard trees are required. Now, existing trees greater than 2 inches in diameter that meet tree preservation criteria can count. So if it's a 3-inch tree and it's preserved, then it can count for street yard trees. Also, all trees measuring 6 inches or more in trunk diameter, measured 4.5 feet above ground, shall count double. So if someone saves an 8-inch tree, that single 8-inch tree can count for 2 trees toward the street yard tree requirement. So existing trees can count, and if the tree is at least 6 inches, an existing tree can count double. Another requirement is that parking lots must be screened from the right of way. And there's a point-based system for this. So 1 point of screening is required for each linear foot of parking lot to be screened. So, for example, if the parking lot frontage along the right of way is 50 feet, then 50 points of screening is required. And screening can include trees, shrubs, decorative walls, and fences. And existing trees meeting preservation criteria can count. And so, for example, this is a Central Market at Lamar near 45th. And this has, some vegetation, some trees, and the decorative wall. So this would be an example of screening the parking lot from the right of way. The requirement isn't to completely obscure the parking lot from the right of way, just to provide something to break up the line of sight. So that's what this does. Here's an example where there is no screening. I'm going to assume this was developed before there was a parking lot requirement here or a vegetation landscape requirement, but this has absolutely no screening. So obviously this is not nearly as nice to look at. It's going to be hotter from the urban heat island effect, less animals living here. But this is an example of a parking lot that would have no screening. Another requirement is that trees are required within 50 feet of each parking space. So a tree in a parking lot island are required within 50 feet of each parking space. And again, the existing trees meet the preservation criteria can count. Additionally, parking lot islands must be at least 8 feet wide. And the idea between this 8-foot width is it helps provide soil volume for tree plantings and helps to avoid sprinkler system overspray onto the pavement. So the parking lot island has to be at least 8 feet wide. And then the total square footage of the islands. So if we're in the street yard, 90 square feet of islands would be required for each 12 parking spaces in the street yard. So that's a lot to think about. But this parking lot is in the street yard. That is, the parking lot is between the building and the right of way. And let's just, then the simple formula is the quantity of parking spaces divided by 12 times 90. So to run some numbers, suppose there's 48 parking spaces here. Well, we'd say 48 parking spaces divided by 12 times 90 is 360. So 360 square feet of islands, medians, and peninsulas would be required in this parking lot. Now, if the parking lot is behind the building, the ratio is a little bit different. It's 60 square feet for each 12 spaces. So the formula would be the quantity of parking spaces divided by 12 times 60. So for every 12 parking spaces in the non-street yard, we have to have 60 square feet of islands. So to run the numbers again, just suppose there's 72 parking spaces here. 72 spaces divided by 12 times 60, 360 square feet of islands, peninsulas, and medians would be required in this parking lot. Now, I know that is a lot to think about, and my best advice is to begin with ECM Appendix C. It's the landscape calculation table. And when the landscape plan is required, your environmental reviewer will require ECM Appendix C in the plan set. But if you follow ECM Appendix C and fill in those numbers, that will help guide the landscape design to compliance. There are other planting requirements. They're not exactly landscape requirements, but they do involve landscape concepts. So vegetation is required for water quality ponds. It's a green pond requirement. And your environmental reviewer is going to ask for a planting plan for the water quality pond to be sure it meets the density, quantity, and species requirements. Parking lot islands should be designed to intercept surface water runoff. It doesn't say shall, because there are some times where that can't be done. So, for example, a gas station, we might not want water running from the gas pumps to any islands because it could have a pretty good pollutant load. So, parking lot islands should be designed to intercept surface water runoff. When compatibility setbacks are required, there can be a vegetation requirement, and that's if there's a proposed use that's not single family directly adjacent to a single family use. There might be a planting requirement between those two uses to help buffer the single family use from the non-single family use. And then there are hill country roadway requirements, and those are very complicated. And I always recommend calling your EV reviewer if you're on a hill country roadway. Loop 360, for example, is a hill country roadway. The The results of the requirements are stunning, but the requirements are very complicated. Loop 360 is a beautiful drive, and the vegetation being preserved along there is fantastic, but the requirements are complicated. So if you're on a hill country roadway, I'd say call the EV reviewer and talk about what needs to be done. And so we're getting close to the end. Just some final thoughts. I would say call your EV reviewer if a project site has slopes over 15%, is within a hill country roadway, if you're within or adjacent to a classified waterway, or grading over 4 feet outside of the buildings or ponds is proposed. Now, a lot of times people will reach out to environmental review about critical environmental features. And I want to just point out, and that's okay, but that's not something that my team looks at. It's an environmental issue, but it's a different team. It's John Clement's team. So LDC 25.8, 281, and 282 limit construction adjacent to bluffs, canyon rim rocks, caves, faults, fractures, seeps, sinkholes, springs, and wetlands. And these are reviewed by the Watershed Protection Department. Those are all critical environmental features, and people will reach out to me or my team asking about them. And unfortunately, it's not something we can assist with. And we just say that's definitely a question for John Clement. But it can be confusing. No worries if you call the wrong person, but we can help get you to the right person. But if you're dealing with CEFs, critical environmental features, that's John Clement's team, and he's the best one to help with that. And so with that, we have crossed the finish line, and we're well ahead of schedule on this. Here are some general resources if anybody wants to do a screen grab on that. Land Development Academy, Municode Chapter 25 EV review works almost entirely in LDC 25.8. Property profile. The last link at the bottom of this table is it shows you what watershed classification you're in, transition zones, critical water quality zones, things like that. So I'll leave that up just for a second in case somebody wants to get a screen grab on that. And then moving on to the next item. Well, we can skip past the bio break, I think, and go to questions. Is that okay, Bianca?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We're here towards the end, so I don't want to lose folks if we have questions. So we're open for questions now. This is our last Q&A. We're here at the end. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? You can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the application. You'll see it says Q&A, or you can use the raise hand function, which is also at the bottom of your screen. If you could go to the next slide.
Okay.
So I'm not seeing any questions come up, so I'll go ahead and just remind y'all, if you haven't yet, go ahead and let us know what you thought of today's presentation. Take that post-engagement survey and give us some feedback. And you can also check out the Land Development Academy website, where we'll be posting all of our recordings and materials. And you can also register for future classes there. I do see one question just came through. Thank you, Kent. It says, concerning floodplain modification, if a floodplain health assessment is not conducted, what ratio of mitigation should be used?
Well, that is a good question as well. And that is actually floodplain modification is something that's looked at by John Clement's team as well. So I don't have an answer for that. It's interesting, John Clement's team looks at some aspects of the Land Development Code 25.8. My team looks at other aspects. And so CEFs and floodplain modification are what John's team looks at. So unfortunately, I don't have that answer.
Okay, no problem. And with these Q&As, I often do reach out to, whatever department it is that can help us answer the question. So I'll reach out to Watershed and see if they can contribute to that response as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I can understanding keeping up with the division of labor of who applies which code can be very confusing. But there is a method to the madness. John's team knows a lot about floodplain and riparian health and vegetation. And so they look at that because it's what they have wetlands biologists and also hydrogeologists. So consequently, they'll look at wetland plants and riparian vegetation and geologic critical environmental features. Whereas my team looks at the grading, the slopes, the impervious cover, the landscape, and the silt fence. But my team, we have an environmental background, but we are not wetlands biologists or hydrogeologists. So the division of labor is follows the expertise basically. So that's why, some people will look at one parts of 25.8, but not all of 25.8. I just want to explain why why my team is like, nope, that's not what we do. We do something a little bit different.
Yeah, that makes sense. And a reminder to everyone here that we do have in October a presentation by John called Development in Austin's Wetlands. And so you can check that out and register for it at that webpage. That's the QR code is up. And then also Ken and Pierce in November, we'll be talking about both water quality and drainage. So those are already in the books. We've already got folks registering. They are going to be webinars, so feel free to sign up for those. And then John also did something about like the history. It was called City of Creeks and kind of the history of why we have some of the, I guess, I don't know, regulations around the creeks that we do here in Austin and why some of them are lacking too, actually. So just kind of the evolution of that. Right, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I guess that'll conclude our meeting today. Again, everyone here is going to receive a link to today's meeting materials, and we'll include those responses to any of the questions from today's meeting. If you do have any additional questions, you can always email us at dsdcommunications@austintexas.gov, or you can reach out to Mike directly, and we'll be happy to get you the information that you need. Again, fill out that survey, let us know how we did, and check out our website to keep connected with us. I think I was doing a little bit of a plug at the last webinar that if you attend 4 Land Development Academy sessions, you are eligible for limited edition Land Development Academy mugs. That logo has now been phased out, so those mugs are only while supplies last, and we would love for you to get one. So keep coming to class, and I'll let you know once you hit the four classes, and we'll have you sipping some coffee out of a very stylish mug. That's all I have. Or do you have any closing words for us, Mike?
Please reach out to EV Review. I'm always happy to help answer questions. If I don't have the answer, I'll do my best to find the right answer for you.
Sounds good. Will do. Thanks all.
Thank you.